The most practical definition of poverty is that now widely adopted, which relates it to function and calls those the poor whose income is not sufficient to keep up their health and working efficiency. This may be vague, but is not too much so to be useful, and is capable of becoming quite definite through exact inquiry. At least it indicates roughly a considerable portion of the people who are poor in an obvious and momentous sense of the word. Being undernourished, the poor lack energy, physical, intellectual, and moral. Whatever the original cause of their poverty, they cannot, being poor, work so hard, think so clearly, plan so hopefully, or resist temptation with so much steadfastness as those who have the primary means of keeping themselves in sound condition. Moreover, the lack of adequate food, clothing, and housing commonly implies other lacks, among which are poor early training and education, the absence of contact with elevating and inspiring personalities, a narrow outlook upon the world, and, in short, a general lack of social opportunity. The poor are not a class in the sense of having a distinct psychical organization. Absorbed in a discouraging material struggle, or perhaps in the sensuality and apathy to which a discouraging outlook is apt to lead, they have no spirit or surplus energy adequate to effectual cooperative endeavor on their own initiative, or even to grasping the benefits of existing organization. As a rule, they get far less from the law and its administration, from the church, the schools, the public libraries, and the like, than the classes more capable of self-assertion, particularly in a laissez-faire democracy, which gives rights pretty much in proportion to the vigor with which they are demanded. It is this lack of common consciousness and purpose that explains the ease with which, in all ages, the poor have been governed, not to say exploited, from above. And if they are getting some consciousness and purpose at the present time, it is largely for the very reason that they are less inveterately and hopelessly poor now than in the past. The familiar question whether poverty is due to personal or social causes is in itself somewhat fallacious, as smacking of a philosophy that does not see that the personal and social are inseparable. Everything in personality has roots in social conditions, past or present. So personal poverty is part of an organic whole, the effect in one way or another by heredity or influence of the general life. The question has significance, however, when it is understood as asking whether or not the cause is so fixed in personality that it cannot be counteracted by social influences. In a community generally prosperous, a part of the people, say 10%, are poor in the urgent sense indicated above. The practical question is, are these people poor from causes so established in their characters, however originating, that the rest of the community can do nothing effectual for them? Or are they plastic to forces which might raise them to a normal standard of living? As to this, there is a fair measure of agreement among competent observers, somewhat to the following effect. There is a considerable number of individuals and families having intrinsic defects of character, which must always keep them poor so long as they are left in the ordinary degree of self-dependence. The great majority of the poor, however, have no ineradicable personal weakness, but are capable of responding to influences which might raise them to a normal standard of living. In other words, the 9/10ths of the community which is not poor might conceivably bring influences to bear which would, in a healthy manner and without demoralizing almsgiving, remove all but a small part of the poverty of the other tenth. It is only a question of putting into the matter sufficient knowledge and goodwill. As to the view still not uncommon, that the laziness, shiftlessness, and vice of the poor are the source of their difficulties, it may be said that these traits, so far as they exist, are now generally regarded by competent students as quite as much the effect as the cause of poverty. If a man is undervitalized, he will either appear lazy or will exhaust himself in efforts which are beyond his strength, the latter being common with those of a nervous temperament. Shiftlessness also is the natural outcome of a confused and discouraging experience, especially if added to poor nutrition. And as to drink and other sensual vices, it is well understood that they are the logical resource of those whose life does not meet the needs of human nature in the way of variety, pleasantness, and hope. There are other causes of vice besides poverty, as appears from its prevalence among the unresourceful rich, but there can be no doubt that good nurture, moderate work, wholesome amusement, and a hopeful outlook would do away with probably the greater part of it. There are no doubt among the poor, as among the well-to-do, many cases of incurable viciousness and incompetence, but it would be no less unjust and foolish to assume that any individual is of this sort than to give up a scarlet fever patient, because some will die of that disease in spite of the best treatment. The ablest and most experienced workers commonly have the most confidence as to what may be done, even with the apparently lazy, shiftless, or vicious, by bringing fresh suggestions, encouragements, and opportunities to bear upon them. And it is only a small portion of the poor that are even apparently lazy, shiftless, or vicious. The majority compare not unfavorably with the well-to-do classes in these respects. Leaving aside general conditions which may depress whole nations or races, the main cause of poverty in a prosperous country like the United States is without doubt some sort of maladjustment between the individual, or the family or neighborhood group, and the wider community, by reason of which potential capacity does not yield its proper fruit in efficiency and comfort. This is evidently the case, for example, with the sort of poverty most familiar in American cities, that due to the transplanting of vast numbers of Europeans to a society out of connection with their habits and traditions. Italians, Slavs, and Russian Jews now thronging the cities are by no means deficient on the whole, either in intelligence, industry, or thrift. And those who know them best find them prolific in some qualities, such as artistic sensibility, in which America is otherwise rather deficient. But the process of adaptation to new industrial conditions is trying, and leaves many in poverty and demoralization. Among the native population also, poverty and the moral degradation often found with it are due largely, perhaps chiefly, to various kinds of maladjustment between the working classes and the industrial system, to loss of employment from periodical depressions or from the introduction of new methods, to the lack of provision for industrial education, to the perils attending migration from country to city, and so on. As to the doctrine, very widely though perhaps not very clearly held, that the poor are the unfit in course of elimination, and are suffering the painful but necessary consequences of an inferiority that society must get rid of at any cost, this rests on mistaken impressions of Malthus and Darwin, and on later eugenic interpretations. The unfit, in the biological sense, are those whose hereditary type is so unsuited to the conditions of life that it tends to die out or at least suffer relative diminution in numbers under the action of these conditions. It is very questionable whether any great part of the poor answer this description. As to hereditary inferiority, it is the prevailing opinion of those most familiar with the matter that, except possibly where a distinct race is in question, their inferiority is due chiefly to deficient nurture, training, and opportunity, and not to heredity. This view is supported by the fact that under the conditions which a country of opportunity like the United States affords, great masses of people rise from poverty to comfort, and many of them to opulence, showing that the stock was as capable as any. As to elimination, it is well known that only poverty of the most extreme and destructive kinds avails to restrict propagation, and that the moderately poor have a higher rate of increase than the educated and well-to-do classes. It is, in fact, far more the latter that are the unfit in a biological sense than the former. The truth is that poverty is unfitness, but in a social and not a biological sense. That is to say, it means that feeding, housing, family life, education, and opportunity are below the standards that the social type calls for, and that their existence endangers the latter in a manner analogous to that in which the presence of inferior cattle in a herd endangers the biological type. They threaten, and to a greater or less degree, actually bring about a general degradation of the community through ignorance, inefficiency, disease, vice, bad government, class hatred, or still worse, class servility and arrogance, and so on. But since the unfitness is social rather than biological, the method of elimination must also be social, namely, the reform of housing and neighborhood conditions, improvement of the schools, public teaching of trades, abolition of child labor, and the humanizing of industry. That there are strains of biological unfitness among the poor, hereditary idiocy or nervous instability tending toward vice and crime, for example, is not to be denied, and certainly these should be eliminated, but poverty, far from affecting elimination, is perhaps their main cause. This will no doubt be duly considered by students of the new science of eugenics. Only a shallow sort of mind will suppose there is any necessary conflict between biological and psychological sociology. As to the question who is to blame for poverty, the whole question of praise or blame is one of point of view and expediency. Blame the poor if it will do them any good, and sometimes perhaps it will, but not so often probably as the well-to-do are apt to imagine. It used to be thought that people must always be held responsible for their condition, and that the main, if not the only source of improvement was to prod their sense of this responsibility. But more thoughtful observation shows that it is not always a good thing to urge the will. Worry, says an experienced worker, is one of the direct and all-pervading causes of economic dependence. And he asserts that take no thought for the morrow is often the most practical advice. Many indications, among them the spread of mind-cure doctrines and practices, point to a widely felt need to escape from the waste and unrest of an overstimulated sense of responsibility. The main blame for poverty must rest upon the prosperous because they have, on the whole, far more power in the premises. However, poverty being due chiefly to conditions of which society is only just beginning to become conscious, it may be said that in the past nobody has been to blame. It is an unintended result of the economic struggle and is done with the elbows rather than the fists. But consciousness is arising, and with it comes responsibility. Society is becoming aware of what makes poverty and how it can in great part be done away with. And if accomplishment does not keep pace with knowledge, it will be to blame indeed. All parts of society being interdependent, the evils of poverty are not confined to one class, but spread throughout the whole. And the influence of a low standard of living is felt in the corruption of politics, the prevalence of vice, and the inefficiency of labor. The cause of the poor is therefore the cause of all, and from this point of view, those of them who, in spite of weakness, discouragement, and neglect, keep up the fight for a decent life and shun dependence and degradation, should be regarded as heroic defenders of the general welfare, deserving praise as much as the soldier at the front. If they are not so regarded, it is because of a lack of intelligence and social consciousness. In a truly organic society, the struggles and suffering of a poor class would arouse the same affectionate and helping solicitude as is felt when one member of a family falls ill. In contrast to this, the indifference or somewhat contemptuous pity usually felt toward poverty indicates a low state of community sentiment, a deficient we feeling. Respect and appreciation would seem to be due to those who sustain the struggle successfully, and sympathetic help to those who are broken down by it. Especially brutal, stupid, and inexpedient is the old way of lumping the poor with the degenerate as the lower class, and either leaving them to bear their discredited existence as best they may, or dealing out to them a contemptuous and unbrotherly alms. The confusion with the degraded of those who are keeping up the social standard in the face of exceptional difficulties is as mean and deadly a wrong as could well be. Insofar as there is an effective, self-conscious Christian spirit in the world, thought, feeling, and effort must concentrate wherever there is injustice or avoidable suffering. That this takes place so slowly and imperfectly in the matter of poverty is largely owing to a lack of clear perception of what ought to be done. There is no doubt that if mere gifts could wipe out poverty, it would be wiped out at once. But people are now, for the most part, just sufficiently informed to see the futility of ordinary alms, without being instructed in the possibilities of rational philanthropy. Rational philanthropy is coming, however, along with an excellent literature and a body of expert persons who unite humane enthusiasm with a scientific spirit. The fundamental remedy for poverty is, of course, rational organization, having for its aim the control of those conditions, near and remote, which lead people into it and prevent their getting out. The most radical measures are those which are educational and protective in a very broad and searching sense of the words. The humanization of the primary school system, industrial education, facilities for play, physical training and healthy amusement, good housing, the restriction by law of child labor and of all vicious and unwholesome conditions, and finally the biological precaution of stopping the propagation of really degenerate types of men. If the children of the poor can be given the right start in life, they will themselves, in most cases, develop the intelligence, initiative, self-control, and power of organization, which will enable them to look out for their own interests when they are mature. The more one thinks of these questions, the more one feels that they can only be solved by helping the weaker classes to a position where they can help themselves. Class animosity by no means increases in proportion to the separation of classes. On the contrary, where there is a definite and recognized class system which no one thinks of breaking down, a main cause of arrogance and jealousy is absent. Everyone takes his position for granted and is not concerned to assert or improve it. In Spain, it is said, "You may give the inch to any peasant, he is sure to be a gentleman, and he never thinks of taking the ell." So, in an English tale written about 1875, one finds the following. The peasantry and little people in country places like to feel the gentry far above them. They do not care to be caught up into the empyrean of an equal humanity, but enjoy the poetry of their self-abasement in the belief that their superiors are indeed their betters. So, at the South, there was a kind of fellowship between the races under slavery, which present conditions make more difficult. A settled inequality is the next best thing for intercourse to equality. But where the ideal of equality has entered, even slight differences may be resented, and class feeling is most bitter, probably, where this ideal is strong but has no regular and hopeful methods of asserting itself. In that case, aspiration turns sour and generates hateful passions. Caste countries are safe from this by lacking the ideal of equality, democracies by partly realizing it. But in Germany, for instance, where there is a fierce democratic propaganda on the one hand, and a stone wall of military and aristocratic institutions on the other, one may feel a class bitterness that is hardly known in America. And in England also, when classes are still recognized but very ill-defined, there seems to be much of an uneasy preoccupation about rank, and of the elbowing, snubbing, and suspicion that go with it. People appear to be more concerned with trying to get into a set above them, or repressing others who are pushing up from below than is the case with us. In America, social position exists, but having no such definite symbols as in England is for the most part too intangible to give rise to snobbery, which is based on titles and other externalities that men may covet or gloat over, in a way hardly possible when the line is merely one of opinion, congeniality, and character. The feeling between classes will not be very bitter so long as the ideal of service is present in all and mutually recognized. And it is the tendency of the democratic spirit, very imperfectly worked out as yet, to raise this ideal above all others and make it a common standard of conduct. Thus, Montesquieu, describing an ideal democracy, says that ambition is limited to the sole desire to the sole happiness of doing greater services to our country than the rest of our fellow citizens. They cannot all render her equal services, but they all ought to serve her with equal alacrity. He thinks also that the love of frugality, by which he means compunction in material self-indulgence, limits the desire of having to the study of procuring necessities to our family and superfluities to our country. If it were indeed so in the present world, there would be no danger of a class conflict. Possibly all states of opinion by which any service is despised are survivals from a caste society, and reminiscent of the domination of one order over another. Just as slavery has left a feeling in the South that hand labor is degrading. So soon as all kinds of workers share freely in the social and political order, all work must be respected. The social prestige of idleness, of conspicuous leisure that still exists in the old world, is evidently a survival of this sort, and it can hardly happen in the democratic future that people will let their nails grow that all may see they do not work. I do not call one greater and one smaller, says Whitman. That which fills its period and place is equal to any. It is likely, however, that there will always be a special esteem for some sorts of achievement, but the grounds for this will, more and more, be distinction in the common service. The excessive prestige of wealth, along with much of the ill feeling which it involves, is also rather a legacy from caste society than a trait congenial to democracy. The ascendancy of riches is really greater in the older and less democratic societies, and it survives in democracy partly because of the tradition that associates wealth with an upper caste, and partly because other ideals are as yet crude and unorganized. A real democracy of sentiment and action, a renewed Christianity, and a renewed art might make life beautiful and hopeful, for those who have little money without diminishing the wholesome operation of the desire for gain. At present, the common man is impoverished not merely by an absolute want of money, but by a current way of thinking, which makes pecuniary success the standard of merit, and so makes him feel that failure to get money is failure of life. As there is no longer much admiration for mere physical prowess, apart from the use that is made of it, so it seems natural that the same should come true of mere pecuniary strength. The mind of a child or of any naive person bases consideration chiefly on function, on what a man can do in the common life, and it is in the line of democratic development that there should be a return toward this simple and human view. It is in accord with this movement that children of all classes are more and more taught the use of tools, cooking, and other primary arts of life. This not only makes for economy and independence, but educates the instinct of workmanship, leading to an interest in all good work and a respect for those who do it. The main need of men is life, self-expression, not luxury, and if self-expression can be made general, material inequalities alone will excite but little resentment. As to the use of wealth, there may be expected a growing sense of social responsibility, of which there are already cheerful indications. Since it is no longer respectable to be idle, why may it not presently cease to be respectable to indulge one's lower self in other ways? In pecuniary greed, in luxurious eating, in display, rich clothes, and other costly and exclusive pleasures. It must not, however, be supposed that narrow or selfish interests will not easily form special groups of their own, encouraging one another in greed or luxury to the neglect of the common life. Such associations cannot altogether shut out general sentiment, but they can and do so far deaden its influence that the more hardened or frivolous are practically unconscious of it. While there are some cheerful givers on a large scale and many on a small one, it is doubtful whether there has ever been, on the whole, a commercial society that contributed a smaller part of its gains to general causes. Much has been done in this way, but the country is enormously rich, and the most that has been by taxation, which falls most heavily upon small property owners. The more communal use of wealth is rather a matter of general probability and of faith in democratic sentiment than of demonstrable fact. Much might be said of the various ways in which more community sentiment might be shown and class resentment alleviated. In the matter of dress, for example, shall one express his community consciousness in it or his class consciousness, assuming that each is natural and creditable? It would seem that when he goes abroad among men, the good democrat should prefer to appear a plain citizen, with nothing about him to interrupt intercourse with any class. And in fact, it is a wholesome feature of American life, in notable contrast with, say, Germany, that high as well as low are averse to wearing military or other distinctive costume in public, except at times of festival or display, when class consciousness is in special function. It is felt that if a man wants to distinguish himself in general intercourse, he should do so in courtesy or wisdom, not in medals or clothes. And why should not the same principle of deference to the community in non-essentials apply to one's house and to one's way of living in general? If there's anything worthy to express in these things, let it be expressed, but not pride or luxury. Let there be no attempt to formalize upon the question what one may rightly spend money for, or to imagine that formalism is practicable. The principle that wealth is a trust held for the general good is not to be disputed, but latitude must be left to individual conceptions of what the general good is. These are matters not for formulas or sumptuary laws, but for conscience. To set up any other standard would be to suppress individuality and do more harm than good. Some would be glad to see almost any amount of wealth spent upon beautiful architecture, though they might prefer that the buildings be devoted to some public use. Let there be beauty, even luxury, but let it be public and communicable. It certainly seems at first sight that vast expenditure upon private yachts, private cars, costly balls, display of jewelry, sumptuous eating, and the like, indicates a low state of culture. But perhaps this is a mistake. No doubt there is some beneficence in these things not generally understood. We do not want uniformity in earning and spending more than elsewhere, only unity of spirit. Some writers praise the emulation that is determined to have as fine things as others have, But while this has its uses, it is a social impulse of no high kind and keeps the mass of men feeling poor and inferior. Our dignity and happiness would profit more if each of us were to work out life in a way of his own, without invidious comparisons. We shall never be content except as we develop and enjoy our individuality and are willing to forego what does not belong to it. I know that I was not born to get or to use riches, but I am willing to believe that others are. An essential condition of better feeling in the inevitable struggles of life is that there should be just and accepted rules of the game to give moral unity to the whole. Much must be suffered, but men will suffer without bitterness if they believe that they do so under just and necessary principles. A solid foundation has been laid for this in free countries by the establishment of institutions under which all class conflicts are referred, in the last resort, to human nature itself. Through free speech, a general will may be organized on any matter urgent enough to attract general attention, and through democratic government, this may be tested, recorded, and carried out. Thus is provided a tribunal free from class bias before which controversies may be tried and settled in an orderly manner. It would be hard to exaggerate the importance to social peace of this recognition of the ultimate authority of public opinion, acting slowly but surely through constitutional methods. It means a moral whole which prescribes rules, directs sane agitation into healthy and moderate channels, and takes away all rational ground for violence or revolution. If men, for instance, believe that a particular kind of socialistic state is the cure for the evils of society, let them speak, print, and form their party. Perhaps they are right, at least they get much wholesome self-expression and a kind of happiness out of their aspiration and labors. And if they are partly wrong, yet they may both learn and impart much to the general advantage. But only a beginning has been made in this. Ethics is only a vague outline, not a matured system, and in the details of social contact, as between employer and workman, rich and poor, Negro and white, and so on, there is such a lack of accepted standards that men have little to go by but their crude impulses. All this must be worked out in as much patience and goodwill as possible before peace can be expected. Where there is no very radical conflict of essential principles, ill feeling may commonly be alleviated by face-to-face discussion, since the more people come to understand one another, the more they get below superficial unlikeness and find essential community. Between fairly reasonable and honest men, it is always wholesome to have it out, and many careful studies of labor troubles agree regarding the large part played by misunderstandings and suspicion that have no cause except lack of opportunity for explanation. The rioting would not have taken place, says a student of certain mining disorders, had not the ignorance and suspicion of the Hungarians been supplemented by the ignorance and suspicion of the employers, and the perseverance of this mutual attitude may yet create another riot. There is a strong temptation for those in authority, especially if they are overworked or conscious of being a little weak or unready in conference, to fence themselves with formality and the typewritten letter. But a man of real fitness in any administrative capacity must have stomach for open and face-to-face dealing with men. And a democratic system sooner or later brings to pass face-to-face discussion of all vital questions, because the people will be satisfied with no other. An appearance of shirking it will arouse even more distrust and hostility than the open avowal of selfish motives. And accordingly, it is more and more the practice of aggressive interest to seek to justify themselves by at least the appearance of frank appeal to popular judgment. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you will be notified when new videos are out. Also, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find many other fundamental advertising and psychology books in different languages. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.